Last time we did the overview of Passport. We installed it into Node/ and talked about how the various pieces fit together. That may not yet have helped you with your project. You didn't really learn how to set up and use Passport. You didn't end last week with code allowing you to log your users in. Well, this week is different. Today, we actually write the code that will let us log our users in and out. We're going to tackle this chronologically, in the order that new users would encounter the site. They'd have to sign up first, so that's where we'll start. Here's our sign up form. It has two fields, namely email and password. It'll be important to remember those names. Now we need to start integrating Passport with our application. Normally we would just do this sort of thing in config application.js, and we will touch that file, but it is getting a little bit out of hand, so we're going to break this out a bit. Let's make a new directory, and it's in config, and we'll call it initializers. And into that directory, we're going to make a file called passport.js. This is a separate module, so let's handle the module interface first. If you need a refresher on that, check out episode 7, Node Code and Other Files. First, we just make a function called init. Then at the end of the file, we'll do our old module exports equals init trick. When setting this up, the first thing we need to do is require the modules we're using. In our case, this is Passport and Passport local, so we do the following. Var Passport, and then we just require Passport. And then for Passport local, we're going to put that into a variable called local strategy. But we're not just using the module itself, we're actually calling the strategy function that it exports. Next, we configure an instance of local strategy like so. We'll call it username and password strategy, and we'll make it a new instance of local strategy. And then we need to give it some configuration. Let's get this out and then we'll go over what it actually means. Alright, let's have a look at what we're doing here. If you recall from last time, our job is to wire up small bits of functionality to the plumbing that Passport provides. Step 1 of that for us is letting Passport know what fields to look for when running our local strategy. When we're doing an authentication, it's going to look in request.body for two fields. If we head over to the Passport documentation, we can see that by default, Passport looks for a username and password. If your application uses a username and password, then you don't need the first object that we passed in, this one. And this style is exactly what you see when you look at the docs. If we come up here to configure and look at their default, notice that there's no mention of username and password or email or whatever because it's just using the defaults. Well, in our case, Passport works, password works just fine, but we chose email addresses for our users, so we wanted to check against email rather than username. This first object that we passed in is just telling Passport which form fields to look for when doing an authentication request. So that configures the fields it's looking for, but to use those fields, we need a function that takes an email address, a password, and a callback that expects an error and a user object if we find it. Seems as though we might just have such a function if we open app models user.js. Remember when we put together find by email and password? Well, let's put that in place here then. Notice that we're not calling find by email and password. We're just passing it to our local strategy instance. There is one small change that we need to make in app models user though, so let's head there. In find by email and password, we need to change this.find1 to model.find1. Why? Well, this is a JavaScript binding question that is outside the scope of this episode, but the short answer is that when we hand this function off to Passport and it calls it later, it won't be calling it with any sort of reference to our user model. That means that the this keyword will not refer to the user model, and that call to find one will crash hard. But back to our initializer. Next comes a little bit of hand waving, which is just another way of saying that it's code that will break if you try running it right now. We fix it later in the episode, so hang out just a bit. Next, we're going to define SerializeUser, and that's going to equal app command SerializeUser. And notice that we are calling the function at the end. And then we also need one called DeserializeUser, which looks much the same. These lines use files that we haven't yet created and a function we haven't yet defined. As soon as we're done with the setup code, we'll go fill in those holes. I beg your indulgence to hold off on the implementation here. We're using this app command function we haven't defined, and I'll give you a teaser hint though. It's going to work just like app.model does for us. But from the names of these functions, we can definitely infer what they do. Back to our tree, we see these two nodes for serialization and deserialization. Now we don't see it in action yet, but authenticating the user will hand off an identifier that Passport will pass to our serialize function. This function will decide what Passport stores in our session cookies. Deserialization is just the reverse. Passport will hand to it whatever we chose to store in the cookie via serialization, and from that we need to come up with a user record from our database. So back in config initializer's Passport, I'm going to add 5 quick lines. So let's just get those out real quick. Okay, so this first line here is telling Passport that we want to use our username and password strategy. That's pretty straightforward. And then the next 2 lines tell Passport how we're going to serialize and deserialize our users. Again, pretty straightforward. The 4th line is what actually boots up Passport and attaches it to our Express instance. If you remember, we can get to that from app.app, and then we're just calling use on it like we do any other middleware. And then this last line tells Passport that we want to use cookies to store our session information. Since we're telling Passport to use cookies, pay attention to what we do next here. But before we get to that, there is one little mistake I made here. I actually wanted all of this code to be inside of this init function. So let's go ahead and make that change and just clean up the curly brace here. We've put all this nice code in config initializer's passport.js, but that doesn't really do us any good unless we include that somewhere in config application.js. But as we just said, Passport needs to use sessions, so it's really important where we put this next line. So let's come on down to our middleware. Immediately below our middleware call to express cookie session, we put this line. Simply app.require config initializers passport.js. And of course, this star was not intentional. And you know what else wasn't intentional? Leaving out that paren. All we're doing here is making sure node calls our Passport initializer. This must come after we declare that we're going to use Express's cookie sessions, so make sure you paste this in after. You're likely going to get mysterious errors otherwise. And one really big note, make really sure that you put the parentheses at the end here, because if you remember, or we could just look at it, our module here is put inside of this function, and so if we just require it without calling the return value, we won't actually run the initialization. You would know that you forgot to do the call here and not just the require if later on you see some mysterious error about not having a strategy called local. This could be the reason why you would get that error. So that closes out our initialization. Now we can get into defining all those bits that we glossed over. First of all, let's define app.command. It's pretty easy. Just to keep things clean, let's go ahead and close our initializer, and then we'll just come up and config application to where we have our other require helpers here. And we'll just grab the model one and then replace model with command and app models with app commands. This function is going to work just like our other require helpers, only of course instead of going to app.models or app.routes, it goes to app.commands. And I'll move the cursor there so you can see the S. Okay, with that done, let's go ahead and make the directory where our commands are actually going to live. And that, of course, will be app commands. Now we can go ahead and create app commands serializeUser.js. First, let's talk about the structure of this file. I really like to use an almost command pattern in situations like this. You can read about the command pattern here at its Wikipedia page, but the gist, and I'm linking to that in the show notes, but the gist of what it means for a web application like Node/ is that I prefer to think in terms of things the system does rather than in terms of the data objects it stores. Operations are my focus point. So we create a command called SerializeUser because this is where the code lives that serializes a user. So let's see that structure. We're going to do some standard module stuff here. So SerializeUser module.exports equals SerializeUser. Now this function itself is going to return another function. And look like that. So this is our bare bones structure of the file. Why do we have these two layers of functions, you wonder? Well, suppose that one day we wanted SerializeUser to take some options. Maybe we want to branch based on our environment or something. By wrapping our actual logic, which will be this inside function, inside of the outer one, we're all set up to maybe take an options parameter or something. Now I realize that we may need it as a bad reason to add things to code, but in this case we're not adding much of anything. I would never build out an entire subsystem that we may need, but this wrapper is a good format for modules, and it really doesn't cause us much trouble when we go to actually use it. Next, this function's job is to take the user object that we pulled from our database when the user sent in the email and password, and its job is to pass back what we want to store in our session cookie. We're serializing the user. We are free to pass back whatever we want, and a lot of tutorials I've seen just hand back the user record returned from the database. That's a fine approach, but I do know for a fact that we're going to build in an admin user type later on, and that this type is completely separate from our normal users because I like that sort of extra clear distinction. Now for that reason, here's what I like to hand back. I like to pass back an object with keys type and ID. Type will be user as opposed to admin later on, and ID will be the user's ID. So we can go ahead and save that. Next, we get to create DeserializeUser. So let's go ahead and create that file. And it's DeserializeUser.js. And then let's just wave our hands and make the file skeleton appear. Nothing spectacular here. Let's do note the signature of the actual function though. It takes two parameters. The first one is going to be whatever the output from SerializeUser was. So in this case, we're outputting this object with type user and ID user ID. That's going to come to DeserializeUser as obj. And the second one is our node pattern of having a callback. Now this callback expects an error if there was one, and the user that we're going to fetch from our database. Now let's have a look at the actual implementation. First of all, we need to get access to our user model. So we're just going to get that through var user equals app.model user. Next, we use the mongoose model function find one. In here to just go user find one, grab the ID from the thing that gets passed to us. And then mongoose, of course, takes a callback. And then we can just hand off whatever mongoose gave to us. Now find one takes a standard MongoDB query, which is an object with conditions. We know we have an ID, so we just want to get the user object with the corresponding ID. Pretty easy, huh? But you got to make sure that you have this underscore in front of ID here. Underscore ID is how Mongo actually stores the ID in the database. So if you don't have this underscore here, it's not going to work because it's not going to query against the correct property. Now I just want to point out one last time that this obj that we received in DeserializeUser is the exact same object that we sent out in SerializeUser. When we return this, when we invoke the callback here, passing in this object, Passport takes that object and stuffs it into our session cookie. And then on the other end of requests, when we're trying to load up which user we currently are, Passport grabs that out of the cookie and hands it right back to us as obj. And that's why we need to go with obj.id, because that is the property that we're setting right here. And we should probably go ahead and save this file. Okay, there's one last thing we need to wire up here, and that's our routes. We need to tell our app that our sign-in requests need to go to Passport. So here we are in config routes. Let's do some typing. First thing that we need to do goes at the very top of the file. We need to access Passport again, so we require it again. Remember that node caches our requires, so we're not reloading all the Passport stuff that got loaded the first time we required it. So we can just do a simple var passport require passport. Next, we modify our sign-in route. So let's head on down here and get rid of this that we had before. And we're going to make a call on Passport to get the function that we need to have here. And we'll go through what all this stuff means in just a second. This version of Passport does require you to spell correctly, so let's just fix that real quick. Okay, with that in place, let's break down what we have. The app.post sign-in should look familiar since we didn't even replace that. If you remember from when we first talked about routes, when we define them, we just give them a string and then functions to run when the request matches that string. And of course, there's the HTTP verb as well. Calling Passport authenticate does just that. This is going to return a function to us. For parameters, we first pass the string local. Now for giggles, if you were to open node modules, passport, local, lib, strategy.js, and head on down to line 53, at least that's where it is on my installation, you see this line where the strategy names itself local. And this line right here is why we gave it this string right here. Next, we pass it an object with some important properties. The first two tell Passport where to redirect in the case of success and failure, respectively. So if we succeed, we just want to go back to the home page. If we fail, we want to go back to the sign-in. The last one is a little message we'll display in the event of a failure, meaning that the user gave credentials that don't match anything in our database. That's not actually going to work for us quite yet because of some other initialization we need to do, but this episode has been going for a long time and we'll get to this in the next one. In fact, if you enter a bad email password combination right now, you'll see an error like type error object incoming message has no method flash. Progress, not perfection. We'll get to this in the next episode. And we're finally ready to fire up this puppy. So let's go ahead and save this file and come over here, run our server, and boom, we got an error. Let's have a look at it. Cannot find module passports.js. And so we come back to application.js and we see that there was another unintentional thing there. Now we can go ahead and start our server. We got another error, and it would seem I got a little overzealous with the parentheses here. So let's go ahead and fix that one. And our thing ran. Awesome. Let's go have a look at the sign up form. So here we are at the home page. The very first thing that we need to do is get a user into the system. So let's head on over to the old sign up form and go ahead and enter that user. So I'm just going to enter a slasher at learnallthenodes.com and put in a dummy password and create that. And we get our old welcome to the game message. And then just because we like to convince ourselves of things, Let's head into Mongo and see if we can find our user. Sure enough, there's a slasher. We're good to go. So heading back here, let's clear this out and go back to our sign-in page. Not go back to it, but go to it for the first time. And now, let us punch in the same stuff we just entered. And we get a big error message. This one's pretty easy to fix. This is what happens when you change the names of things. So instead of DB for callback, we want CB, because call, after all, does start with a C. So let's go ahead and just reload, resubmitting the form in the process. Of course, we have to restart the server. And what we see here, we got redirected back to the home page. Now from our code, that means that it worked. We're not seeing anything different right now, so let's put in some logging to convince ourselves that what we wanted to happen actually happened. Okay, to do this, we're just going to open our home routes file. And instead of this really simple call, we're going to put in something to check to see if we have a user in the request. And if we do, we're going to say hello to whoever that user is. And if not, we'll just give ourselves a little message that says no user. Simple enough. Let's make sure to restart our server, come back to our browser, and we will reload the home page. And that reloaded. So now let's head back over here and scroll back up in our server output. And we see hello, a slasher at learnallthenodes.com, meaning that our app is aware that we have a user currently logged in. And now, just for completeness, we're going to work a little Firebug magic here. And we can see that we have this session cookie set that has our information that we stored in it. And you might be wondering, wow, that would be really easy to just go in and change that value. But this information right here makes it so we can't do that. That's the cookie signature, which would let us know if this was tampered with, because in theory, only we have the cookie secret back on the server. So let's go ahead and just delete this cookie. That'll be the same as what logging out would do for us. And now when we reload this page and head back over to our server output, we can see that it says no user, just like we would expect. We also need to make a way for users to log out. So let's just head over to config routes real quick. And we can come back down here. And we'll just reuse that real quick. And then we're not making a new one, we're destroying one. And then we can just open up app routes, session routes, and we'll add a new function here called destroy. And it takes a request and a response object. And here's some passport specific stuff. We're going to call request or rec.logout. And some more code that's going to fail for us right now because we don't have some configuration done. Successfully signed out. And then we need to redirect ourselves back to the home page. But let's go ahead and just comment this out real quick because that will cause problems for us. And then of course we need to expose this function to the outside world, like so. And then we can just come here and restart the server. And we see that that works. And now there's one UI change that we need to make because it doesn't really do us much good to have a logout route if users don't know about it. So we can just come down here and make that change right there. So let's head back to our homepage. Now our current state is that we're not logged in, and this shows up. That's something we're going to fix in the next episode. So let's go ahead and sign our user back in. A slasher and the password. And now I don't really want to memorize that. Now let's head back to our console output real quick, and we see, yep, I'm logged in. That's good. And now I'll come here and hit sign out, and I'm right back at the home page. But now when I go back and look at that server output, I'll see that it says no user. And in fact, if I were to look back at the cookie, we'd see that everything's cleared out. That's what this rec.logout does. That's a function that Passport adds to our request objects, and that gives us a way to log the user out, which is something we need to have. Fantastic, right? Well, hopefully that wasn't too much of a whirlwind. We saw how to actually wire up Passport to get a user authenticated via email and password. If you have questions, please ask them in the comments so that if there are confusing parts, we can go back over them. There's a whole lot that isn't production ready about what we did here. For example, that last bit about the sign out link, it's pretty obvious that we shouldn't show that unless the user is logged in. We've done all the work to get a user logged in, but we're not actually doing anything with that yet. And you'll also notice that no part of the site is restricted based on whether or not the user is logged in. That's authorization, and that's a topic for another time. We also haven't done anything with the flash that we added. That's in the pipeline too, I promise. We will get to that in the next few episodes. So until then, happy coding.